Okay. Our expectation for today is kind of more of a discussion. We do have some slides that we'll share if there's interest in that. Probably the best way to start is with our rationale of why we decided to start doing some local surveys. And our discussion started probably 4 or 5 years ago as we began looking at some of the data that the YRBS was presenting and not presenting. We were finding that with the YRBS, there's a certain level of numbers, sample size that you had to have before they would share the data. And it's nice getting that overall data, but it really wasn't breaking it down into the subcategories that were helpful for us in the community in terms of guiding our program and giving us information about some of the subpopulations in our group, even to the point of male-female breakdown. Sometimes with the YRBS, we weren't getting that. And so programmatically, Paul and I started talking and then started talking with the coalition members to say, what would be helpful for our community? And really what we discovered is that when we start breaking it down into subpopulations, that's where we get usable, helpful information that guides our program, as well as allowing us to target some of our prevention strategies. So that's why we started developing our local, we call it the SUSY, Substance Use Survey Youth, and then it either has an MS or a HS, which is either middle school or high school on it, so that we can identify which group it comes from. Along with that initial thought process, we started there was a couple of years where our school district didn't have the capacity, I guess, to really support our surveys. So the last 3 years, we did two things. We incentivized the survey. We built that relationship with the high school and the middle school, to build that sense of trust. That we were going to utilize the information appropriately and protect the privacy of the people that were providing the information. So that worked out really well. Incentivize wise, we provide, at the same time COVID was happening. And so a lot of the financial support through the school district, because of the new demands of what COVID was putting on people. We wanted to be able to support the high school and the middle school, so we incentivized. We give $1,000 per class if our threshold was 65% response rate. We would give each class $1,000 for student activities. So through the grades, that would be about $7,000 plus an extra $500 for the highest middle school, highest high school class that returned the surveys. And it's paid off really well because we've been hitting an average of about 85% return up to about 97% return for some of the classes. So you can see that we're getting a lot better data information from our community then. Which we could not possibly get from the YRBS. Anything you want to add in that realm, Paul?
No, I don't think so. I think you've covered the big points.
Okay. And part of the reason we decided to do that too is that has to do a little bit with equity. When you consider that our community is 65% white, and if you can't break down the data into subpopulations, everything's being skewed towards the white population. And when we started looking at race and ethnicity, there were some use patterns in some of the substances that were really different than the dominant society or the dominant group in our community. So I really noticed that with the school climate and connectedness, when you ask something about, does your school support your culture? And if you look at the overall, it was really positive. But then you have to take into fact that over 65% of the students were white. And so of course they would, the results, when you look at it in total, would suggest that we're doing really good in supporting the various cultures in our schools. So all that kind of boiled up to the top for us. And as Paul and I were talking, we really wanted to move into that, a local survey where we could get a higher return rate and start looking at some of the demographic differences in use patterns. So that just to kind of, we got like 5 slides here, and I'll share the screen, Paul, if you want to talk a little bit about it. And again, I want this to be kind of more of a discussion, but I think there are some things that may be helpful to understand from our perspective. And some of these things I already talked about, but Paul, do you want to take the lead on that? And if you have questions, just raise your hand and we can go in whatever direction the group wants to go. We're just trying to provide something for discussion here.
Yeah, I'll go through these pretty quickly, but geez, Loyd, you use my slides from 2 days ago. You should know me better than that. I changed my slides at the last 2 minutes. Anyway, so we just found, I'm going to skip down to this bottom here just to say that YRBS data really aren't available to inform our efforts, because we know with a lot of things, we need to know data that are stratified at a level that we can't get from YRBS or other initiatives. So just to give an example, just to have something visual, I had this split up so you didn't have to look at too much at one shot, but this will do. If we look on the left side, the YRBS limitation, essentially to get our sample sizes over 100, we have to pool all grades 9 through 12 for any question. This is 30-day binge drinking. This is actually from our survey, but it's the same question as the YRBS question. With our survey, we can do what I have over here on the right, where it says SUSE opportunity. And there we can stratify by grade and by gender and still look at some patterns. And so I think that's really important. As you can imagine, is if you extrapolate this over in a time series or something like that, you start to see patterns that are just essentially impossible to see with the data we get from the YRBS. So if we're gonna, can you go to the next slide?
I just want to say something about this one too. So for an example, if you look at the YRBS, you look at all, you got 12.4. Looking at all for us is right around the same thing. But when you look at that 12th grade area, we begin to see some really different use patterns, especially with the females. And
I think where Loyd was going, he was going to talk about the data a little bit more, and I was just going to try to show an example. But I think he was just saying on the left, that's essentially what we would get from YRBS data. We'd see the pooled sample. In the green, that's all genders. So essentially, we're just over minimum sample size there with the YRBS. With our survey, we can stratify at different things. As Loyd was talking about, we can look at this with grade, gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera. And it just gives us a much more powerful baseline from which to generate prevention efforts. And so just to take the next step in what data might look like, this is just grade 12 data, and we can look at this over time. So these are independent 12th grade classes. So the spring 19 12th graders, the fall 20 12th graders, and the fall 21 12th graders. And just looking at both 30-day alcohol use and 30-day binge drinking. And so we can take those data. Again, this is something we couldn't do with our community size. And some folks in communities that are even smaller than us, this might be a valuable way to look at it. Anyway, it is important. Yeah.
Well, it looked like Tiffany had a question.
Oh, go ahead, Tiffany.
Thanks, Ruby. I actually tried to put my hand down. I think you answered it. On the YRBS when it was showing that the green was higher than either the pink or the blue. And so But then you said it includes all genders. So my assumption would just be that if people mark something other than male or female, they drank at higher rates. Otherwise, it's just confusing to me how the green could be higher than either.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens when there's very little difference between males, females, and then you add all, if that's, that can kick it a little bit over, a little bit under either of the other two. So yeah, you were exactly right. You don't see that if there's a large difference between males and females. I think the local data collection, there's just a lot of opportunities. We can stratify data that are useful for us into what we need, what we want to find out, how that might inform our prevention efforts. We can customize it for local needs. It's important for us to integrate the data vertically and horizontally. So we don't want to be off on our own doing our own thing. We want our data to be able to mesh with state level or national level data. So that's why we include, when we can, as many of the core measures and other consistent measures as possible. And it's also helpful for local partnerships, and it also gives us our what, where, when, and how data that is really important for generating logic models and other tools for prevention efforts. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with it too. Data integrity is important. I'm a little bit leery sometimes when I hear local efforts, just because I want to make sure that the data are being treated respectfully and that there's a good management plan in place. Confidentiality and or anonymity can be an issue in smaller communities, and so we have to build in ways to protect that. And I think it's important, as I mentioned just a moment ago, just to have data that are useful at multiple levels, not just for what we're doing here in Sitka or wherever your community is, but also have something that can integrate with other initiatives. It allows us to do something like this, to where we can, just create these info sheets that really just, kind of resonate with the community, whether it's the assembly or the school district or the school or public health or just community members, that they can see something that is actually about our community. And I think that just helps engage people in what's happening on the ground.
Paul, I'm just wondering if you all secured an IRB for this evaluation?
I predicted this would be the first question. We did not, and there are a couple of reasons for that. If using an IRB decision tree, we kind of fall out of the requirement for an IRB. I was actually pretty surprised early on when my background is doing this kind of work with universities and other entities. So, I'm usually going through IRB processes, but it doesn't constitute research. And it's really used for programmatic level activities. And so that kind of kicks us out of the IRB requirement. However, I was still pretty surprised that the funders have never even brought it up. They know what we're reporting, they know what we're doing. And my experience with NSF, National Science Foundation, or most of my works with the National Institutes of Health, that's always front and center, the IRB work. But apparently, with their review of what we're doing, or with the funders' reviews, and them knowing what we're doing, working with the schools, and we're not actually, Sitka Counseling or myself, we're not actually deploying the survey. The survey gets deployed through the school district sites. And so there seems to be a few things there that kind of kick us out of the IRB. Early on, I thought we were kind of right on the edge. It's like where, and I don't know if you've been around a lot of IRBs, sometimes it's hard to tell. And the default is like, well, submit it and see what the review says. But the short answer is no, we have not had IRB review.
I think it would be so valuable to even take one whole hour and have a discussion about IRB. I just feel like some of us feel like we can't gather this kind of data, even though we really want to, because we're told that we would need an IRB. And I do see funders looking the other way when there does seem to be institutional review board, and somebody from the university could speak to what an IRB is way better than me. But I just think this is a really important, interesting topic.
It is, and I deal with IRBs all the time, and yeah, an hour wouldn't do it justice. There's people I've talked to about IRBs for days and weeks, and there's can be so much variation from state to state, from IRB to IRB. That's a big topic. It really is. So, and a lot of opinions out there, but what I've kind of gone back to is I've gone to a few in some of my trainings and stuff, I've gone to look at, okay, what are the decision trees for requiring an IRB? And I feel pretty comfortable that most IRBs would look at this, if someone reviewing it would look at it and just waive the requirement. But pretty surprised that at the national level, there doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion in this type of work, as much as I would anticipate.
Marilyn, you have your hand up.
This question can go to either Paul or Loyd or both of you. So I have done several years worth of work with some CDC funded projects that target health professionals, but it's trying to get health professionals to have conversations with their clients, many of whom are females. And I'm curious about that, the outlier with regard to that significantly higher rate for drinking for the senior girls, both in contrast to the boys, but also just in general. And I'm wondering if, you guys were probably just trying to establish a baseline, but I'm wondering if there's been any interest or curiosity or effort to sort of look at what is shifting that behavior for that particular cohort.
We are starting to look at that. That's been kind of my number one priority, and I'm just kind of I'm the guy in the back room, messing around with data. But it's been my main focus and it's been consistent every year. So either it's consistent that females are reporting differently, more honestly or less honestly, I don't know, but it's so consistent. And that's what, every year that we see that same pattern. And it seems
interesting.
It looks like a similar pattern is starting to develop with marijuana as well. And so one of the things we have done is we have questions in there about access. How are they accessing? Where are they accessing? Well, I don't know if this is surprising. Females tend to indicate that their first their initiation with alcohol and then whether or not their parents know they're drinking or they drink with their parents is higher with females so far in our 3 data collection events. So it looks like there's something real there in terms of the rates at which drinking and binge drinking, and also posting or parental knowledge of. It looks like there's something there, and it'll probably take us another couple of years to suss that out a little better, but I've been very interested in that. I don't have to tell anyone on this call that, that pattern can lead to all kinds of unhealthy outcomes. So,
my interest is related to how an unintended pregnancy or mistimed pregnancy and drinking may connect, right?
Right.
And we know that teens are less likely to access contraception. Anyhow, interesting stuff, you guys.
Yeah. Well, and from my perspective, what happened a few years ago is the alcohol industry discovered that they were missing part of the population, about half the population, the female population. And so they had a targeted effort in terms of advertisements to recruit, especially young females. Same thing with the tobacco industry. And so that's when we started seeing a lot of the Alka-Pops, the Mike's Hard Liquor type of stuff come out that appealed more towards females. So realizing, and that was back probably 7, 8 years ago, actually, that we began to see that trend in terms of advertising. And that advertising paid off because we're now seeing, especially locally, females drinking at a higher rate than males, and that's been for the last few years. So, and we haven't seen that trend, but my suspicion is, and I can't prove it, is that, again, it had to do with alcohol advertising, targeting that specific age group and gender group. Any other things in terms of questions or anything that we can, that you want to know more information about what we're doing, how we're doing things?
Looks like Riley has his hand up.
I'm sorry? Oh.
Go ahead, Riley.
Thanks, Rebecca. I have so many questions. I'm so glad that I'm here right now. So working with the state of Alaska right now and maternal and child health, the problem that you both ran into with the use risk behavioral survey is almost exactly the problem that I'm trying to address and find some creative solutions to work around. So it's very nice to meet you too. I think I wrote down some questions that I would really like to know how you guys did it. So Paul, you kind of explained how data was stored. Could you go over maybe like how, was this data in a encrypted database, or was it on a secure folder, or were there any problems that you experienced protecting this information?
Well, I mean, it's all password protected. I mean, really, no one outside of, essentially Loyd and I have access to the raw data. And the school district does not have access to it. So we have that, you know, it's essentially not public, you know, public access data. And the other thing that, because the way we're collecting the data, the school district doesn't have access to the raw data, and neither Loyd and I have access to the individuals that are providing the data. So there's kind of a double firewall there. I have no way to determine who's submitting what data. And the school district has no way to identify whether or not a given individual has even submitted any data, not to mention the data that they do submit. So there is that. I think there's always room to build higher levels of security. And you know, some survey platforms are more secure than others. So I think there's a lot of ways to do that. I think it's kind of dependent on what the community needs are, or what your needs are with the data, or what level of security. I work on several projects that go all the way up, you know, that have a pretty broad range of how secure the data need to be based on the type of data that are being collected. So I think there's plenty of opportunities to select whatever platform would suit your needs.
Okay. Great. So PII was not necessarily attached to each survey or each record. Okay, that's great. So then that brings me to my second question: is how did you administer this survey? Was it through cell phones, or was it online, or was it in person? And what were the problems that you guys had in actually administering the survey and collecting responses?
Yeah, technically speaking, we don't administer it. Well, it's kind of hard. So we essentially developed a link that the school district sends out to, or the school sends out to the students, and the students use that link to then for access to an online survey platform. And so the school doesn't so it's kind of hard to tell who actually administers it, but let's say we do. It's all electronic, and the school does not see who takes the survey or the survey data that are collected.
Got it. Okay, that is great. Great way of doing this. Thank you.
In larger communities with more advanced infrastructure, I mean, there's certainly even more secure ways to do it, certainly, but we feel pretty comfortable where we are. And there's no, and all the data are de-identified. I mean, there's no identifying data collected, so, I mean, gender, race, ethnicity, but we leave those questions open as far as we don't require answers to them, but generally people tend to answer them.
One of the other things that I like about the whole thing is that I don't want to deal with the raw data at all. So from my perspective, in terms of being the director of the prevention, I tell Paul, this is what I want to know. I want to look at 12th grade male, female use patterns for these substances. And then I get the answer to that specific question. And so for me, I don't necessarily even want to have access to any of the raw data. I just want to see the summary that applies to the work that I want to do. So
I think one thing that's important too is that on the responsibility slide, there are reasons why there's a sample size limitation for YRBS data, and we have to be cognizant and respectful of that as well. And that's why, when I show the slides that said males, female, all, that's as stratified as we're going to get, because our samples, once we're beyond males and females, our sample size gets really small. Then we're starting to look at identifiable data, or potentially identifiable at the school level. And so there's still that responsibility to have some sort of a threshold that you can't really fall below in terms of sample size. Otherwise you might, not specifically identify individuals, but make them much more highly identifiable just based on the size of the sample and the responses. So for instance, if someone is using a non-male female identifier, our sample size drops considerably, and we don't show data stratified at that level, or for that variable, for that reason.
Yeah, and that problem right there is what I'm trying to work out. And I have another one too, and it kind of goes with that graph that you showed us. I was wondering, were those raw responses, or were they dated or weighted data? Just wondering how you got around any problems of non-response, or any problems with non-response or oversampling or undersampling. I know you had some smaller numbers, but I'm wondering if other communities might not have the resources to weight their own data, if that's something that they wanted to do.
I'm trying to think. This could be a long discussion. I'll try to think of. So just to go back to the data. So when I'm trying to think of which slide it might have been that you were referring to. So the percent response is really the percent responding a certain way of all of the respondents for a particular question, for a particular survey item. So essentially that's how we've dealt with all the data that way. Otherwise, it runs it. And actually the first couple of years we had to modify how we asked the questions to make data summaries and data analysis a little bit easier, because we had so many kind of skip logics in the survey and stuff, and we've kind of had to really think about how we actually administer or structure the survey to make the data a little more easy to capture. Is this the slide you were?
I was thinking of this slide, because when I see this, I was like, oh, maybe maybe 12th grade men were, those young men might have been shy to tell the truth and skip the question. I'm wondering if you all tried weighting it or anything like that, because I've heard from other communities that want to do something like this is that they don't always have the resources to do a survey and then have the accurate results.
Yeah, and we're really just, I mean, these essentially are the way we've presented this is the next step up from raw data, really, just as I said before, just looking at the fraction of those who answered that particular item. So they're not weighted anyway in any form now.
And sorry, everybody on this meeting. I really don't mean to hog the questions, but I really have a lot of questions. This is great.
Well, and you can feel free to call me or Loyd at any time as well if you want to discuss it in greater detail.
That might be helpful. Yeah.
Keep asking if you want. It don't look like anybody else is asking. So.
Yeah, I'm not trying to just deter you.
Well, I'll ask, I just put a question in the chat bar. Did you ask a question about marijuana use? I'm just wondering how the genders broke down.
Yes, we did. Our targeted substance is tobacco in all of its delivery forms. So vaping, smoking, non-smoking, marijuana vaping, and the forms that takes for delivery, alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, and prescription medications. Those are the 4 targeted substances. And so we asked basically the same questions of each substance. And do you remember what I think the pattern for male, female use was similar, wasn't it, Paul?
It is similar. That's just mentioned it a little bit earlier on a earlier question, and starting to see similar patterns like we see with alcohol in terms of gender. I think one thing that I looked at the data, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago or so, a little bit on this, but it seems, if I recall correctly, for most substances, males are initiating a little bit earlier, like a year or so earlier than males, but the females really come on strong in their use rates. But once they initiate, it seems like they're not typically initiating till like junior, senior year, whereas males are oftentimes a year or so earlier than that, at least in initiation. And there's some after a few years of looking at some of the data, like some of the prescription medication misuse, as far as we can tell, Sitka is on, as far as prescription medication, there's not a misuse, there's not a lot of it going on. And so we're kind of just monitoring that, just keeping it back there without asking a bunch of questions of it, because there's so few people responding affirmatively that they're using. But we still ask about attitudes. But Sitka is really high when it comes to alcohol, especially, and tobacco is pretty high as well.
And I just put up that the thing about marijuana right there, if you can see my screen. So the use patterns between male, female.
One thing that we probably should wrap up the questions in a couple of minutes. But one thing, Loyd, I think when we talked to you about the data scan, you also talked about how the YRBS had changed one of their questions, the wording of one of their questions about prescription use, drug use. And since you guys are doing more community-based data collection, you guys were able to keep that consistent, which I thought was an interesting strength of this approach. You wanted to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, depending on the one question in particular with prescription drugs was originally it was use of prescription medication in the last 30 days. Well, when the opioids started becoming a real concern, that question changed to prescription pain medication. And so there's no, when you start looking at trend data, changing that question really interrupted that flow. And so one of the advantages, I think, with local surveying is that we can maintain control over the questions and how the questions are asked. If you change one or two words in a question, you're changing the question somewhat. And that becomes a concern. And so being able to have that control over asking the question consistently, for me, was really important. Especially when we start looking at the trends, the patterns that we want to look at. So we can, with our local data now, we can kind of project. One of the things that we're seeing in this last, the 2021 survey was the regular drinking and binge drinking for females. The two trend lines are starting to come together. And that might suggest that our youth aren't drinking just to drink, but they're drinking to get drunk. And so that's something that we need to be aware of at a local level that we can start counteracting now. We can begin to see those trends after 2 or 3 years, 3-4 years of collecting this data, keeping the questions consistent, that we can begin to say, okay, it looks like this is beginning to happen, and we can begin to do some interventions to address that particular thing. We can start targeting some of our prevention efforts. And so that was really the goal that Paul and I had when we started talking about this, is we want to use this information to impact our community and to maybe get out front of some of the trends that we see happening.
One more question. One more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You just talked about changing the questions of the wording and all of that. I'm wondering now, were there any problems, like resource-wise, of implementing a survey to validate or pre-test those questions? Or was the survey created and went out, and then you realized that you had to tweak some questions, or if you weren't getting the data that you thought you would get in the same format that you wanted? What were the problems there with building your own survey? And is that something that would be more helpful if there were predetermined, validated survey questions that you could pick and pull from, or have input on changing and getting the validation before actually implementing it? Sorry, that was long.
No, that's kind of the story of every survey I've ever written. And so I do a lot of surveys, and validations always comes up. We have, I've never been around a survey development project that didn't require tweaking, from year to year, just because you'll see something in the data that come up and say, boy, is this really what, are we really getting are we getting the data we think we're getting? So it kind of leads towards the validation questions. But we kind of have this survey that we're doing that, as far as I'm concerned, unless Loyd feels differently, we're happy to share it with anyone who's interested. We're consistent with the core measures questions that are essentially asked nationally. So that's kind of that vertical integration that I was alluding to earlier in the slides. So that essentially those are validated items. And now a lot of the other items, we need to understand what's happening locally. And so by doing the several iterations of this, we're essentially building a validation. And there was kind of a pre-validation process as we, not just Loyd and I, we had several people looking at these questions, and I have a pretty strong background in assessment, and so developing questions is something that I think is really important. Or developing good items is really important. It can make or break any kind of instrument. So So we're kind of, to answer your question, we're kind of like partially validated and in process on other parts of the survey just by implementing it. And then those other parts also have gone through multiple iterations to make sure that we're gathering the data we think we're gathering. But it's always a concern. And a full validation procedure really has been done on the core elements of this survey.
And I just want to say one last thing, that I think the importance of local data is that it leads us to ask additional questions. And then the data that we do have, so we start off like with that total data, break it down into male, female, and if there's, depending on the sample size, will allow us to go down to 12th grade females, 12th grade males, and then even further down to looking at other demographics. We get to the point either we're below our threshold of the numbers of people that and then we stop. We don't even go any further, or the data tells us that we don't need to go any further. And I think that's one of the real advantages that and I don't know if I explained that so that people understood, but and then in terms of reporting that out, if there's no reason, like if there's no really significant difference between, say, 12th grade males, 12th grade females, we don't report any. It doesn't show up in our infographics. It doesn't show up in other places because we don't need to go any further. There's no significant difference at a level down, I guess. I don't know if that made sense, but so that's one of the things that I like about it in terms of local data, is that it does allow us to do those things that we just couldn't get with a statewide. And I think both have roles to play. Both are important.
Do you see Kate's question in the chat there, Loyd?
Yeah. Again, that'll depend on the group that we're sharing with. We'll share more in-depth data with the school district. But if we're going to present to community or to the assembly, we might just go with we're trying to give the information in what's palatable to the group that we're addressing. And so we might change the format or the look of the data and the depth of the data. Like for our assembly, they don't want to get into the nitty-gritty fine details. They just want to know, is there an issue going on with our youth in our community? And so we'll show the information that suggests yes, it is, or no, it's not. And that, again, that's what I like about the local data gathering, and is that we can really tailor the information because we have the information. We just can tailor it then to the groups that we're presenting to and what we believe or what they've told us their interest level is. Again, the school district will want a little bit more finer detail probably than the assembly or community members. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, we have kind of a interesting situation here, is that Loyd and I are on different ends of the spectrum when it comes to collecting data in some ways, in the regards that my mantra is, let's limit what we're collecting, because I mean, we have so much data. I mean, we have just enormous quantities of data. We could just be sitting there chewing on data all the time. So I think that's one thing that's really important, is to find where that balance is for an individual community and the resources that are available in that community to process it, to use it. It's not really appropriate to be asking a lot of people when you're not going to be using the data. So, there's a lot of questions that revolve around not just the quality of data collected, but the usefulness and the potential to use those data. So, and those are community level discussions and considerations.
Does anyone else have any questions about question development or sharing of data or sharing of results? Really is what we're talking about here. Just want to leave the floor open in case anybody else has any other questions for Loyd and Paul. And Loyd and Paul, are you guys okay with us connecting you with folks if they reach out and would like to be connected?
Yeah, no worries.
Definitely. There are some questions that I would naturally refer to Paul. That's more, the data survey type of stuff, the nitty gritty. But in terms of, whys, what's and whens, those are the questions that I would be more, the way I look at things is that I'm gonna look at our community and say, what is it that I think our community needs to know about use patterns? And then I'm going to go to Paul and say, this is the type of information that I want, because I think it's helpful in terms of prevention programming. How do we ask the question? How do we get that information? So it's been a really good partnership. And because again, Paul and I tend sometimes be at the opposite ends of the spectrum. I want to know everything about everything, but do I need to know it, and will we actually use it? If we're not going to actually use it, there's no sense gathering the data. And Isha, you had a question.
Hi, yes. I know we chatted a little bit more about you partnering with, the school district and getting having the discussions for like 5 years. Did you guys have to do some advocacy, talk to the school board, do some public testimony? I'm just curious because our region opted out of this year's RYBS and they're going to the school climate survey. Yeah, so those, I'm just in thoughts.
Yeah, we focus more at each of the schools with individuals that have power within the school and built the relationships there. And that's why it took a little bit longer, I think, for us to get where we are. But building that sense of trust, the old axiom, no trust, no beginning. If there's no reason for them to trust us, either collecting the data, sharing the data, then I wouldn't want to be a partner then, if that's not there from their perspective. So, and then as a coalition, finding out what their needs are that may not even be related to survey and data gathering, that what's going to help you support your students in your schools. And that was part of that relationship building. And that took a while. When I first came here, nobody knew me. And so I reached out and made it a point to connect with the principal and the vice principal and the counselors and get our staff into the school to support what their mission was. And then attached, say, hey, well, we've got this great relationship. How about, what's a good way to get information to help you?
Is there only one high school in Sitka?
We have a high school boarding school, Mount Edgecombe High School. We have a Pacific High School, which is an alternative high school. There's about 20, 30 kids in it. And then we have the public high school, the large public high school, and then one middle school.
Do you have a school district-wide survey? So do you just do it per school?
We just do it per school, one in the middle school, one at the high school. And one of the things that we discovered a couple of years ago, we did a survey with Mount Edgecombe students. And because it's a very controlled environment, there were some really divergent results. And so we chose not to combine the two high schools, the information with the two high schools. because of that, because the use patterns, just because it was a very highly controlled environment, were really different. You know, when you started looking at 30-day use, those type of things. So it really skewed data. So we kept them separate now.
How many years have you been surveying the schools now?
What has it been, 3 years, Paul?
Yeah, with this particular survey, it's 3 years. Yeah, 3 years.
Yeah, I think 2019 was the first. And then we just finished in October, we finished the 2021 survey.